We love ourselves a good budget smartphone, and lucky us, we've got two pretty decent ones in the Realme C15 and the POCO M3. They were both launched very recently with exactly the same price. They start at 599 ringgit, but have very different specs.
So today, we are going to find out which of these two is really the one for you.
But before we get started, let's list out some of the similarities first.
Yep, so both phones has a 6000 mAh battery with 18 watt fast charging. Both still has a headphone jack, and they're still using a physical fingerprint scanner. So the POCO M3 has it on the side and the Realme C15 has it on the back. They even have the same storage configuration of 4GB of RAM and up to 128GB of storage. But when it comes to design, I actually think the Realme C15 is prettier, so it looks more familiar with this multi-tone panel, and it also has a matte texture, so no fingerprints.
On the other hand, the POCO M3 is more in your face with a large plastic panel that covers much of the top part of your back cover, and this is also where your POCO logo sits. And although the finish is matte as well, it feels more plasticky than the Realme C15. But hey, if you want something that looks a little different, something more unique, then the POCO M3 is for you.
But the Realme C15 has a 6.5-inch HD Plus screen, and it comes with pretty high peak brightness and quite natural looking colors.
On the other hand, the POCO M3 has a 1080p screen that's generally sharper, but unfortunately the peak brightness is not as high as the Realme C15, and the colors can be a little oversaturated, but the differences in these areas are quite subtle. But to make up for this, the POCO M3 does have a pretty nice set of stereo speakers, one at the top, one at the bottom, and for a budget smartphone, the audio quality on this is actually very nice. It's balanced, it has depth, and it doesn't crackle at high volumes.
So the Realme C15 isn't too bad either, even though it doesn't have stereo speakers. The audio is still quite balanced, and it also doesn't crackle at max volume. It just doesn't offer the same depth as the M3. Okay, enough about that. Let's talk about what I like most, cameras. So the Realme C15 has a 13 megapixel lens paired with an 8 megapixel ultra wide sensor, a 2 megapixel black and white sensor, and another 2 megapixel retro camera. On the other hand, the POCO M3 has 3 lenses in total, a 48 megapixel lens paired with a 2 megapixel macro lens and another 2 megapixel depth sensor. I guess it's pretty cool that a budget phone like this packs a high-res camera.
Yeah, and as usual, of 48 megapixel shots, they are nice and sharp, and you definitely get this with the POCO M3. But the thing about the POCO M3 is that it has Xiaomi's imaging software, which always makes images a little bit too oversaturated, and this carries over to the 12 megapixel mode as well.
As for C15, I think it has more natural colors, but it easily overexposes the images, especially if you're under broad daylight. But then again, it has an ultra-wide camera, which I think is pretty important for those who like taking photos.
Well, that's true, but at least the POCO M3 does have a macro lens, which I think some people will appreciate over the ultra-wide lens. So taking photos with macro mode is very easy. It's point and click, the subject stays quite sharp, and it has good background subject separation. And speaking of background blur, portrait mode on this phone is actually pretty good as well. It can be adjusted, the level of bokeh that you want, through the camera app itself, but again, the image colors can be a little intense.
On the Realme C15, I think the bokeh effect is alright. It actually has softer edges as compared to the M3, but it still is slightly overexposed. But if you're taking like not under the sunlight, then the portrait photos turns out fine.
But what about the night photos?
Right, so when it comes to night photos, I think the Realme C15 is a clear winner. Despite having night mode, the POCO M3 doesn't really brighten up the photos, so it's good at retaining details at lighted objects like signboards or even your street lamps, but the pictures are still darker than expected. For the Realme C15, the pictures are well lit and it's also usable on ultra-wide shots.
Yeah, even with your nighttime selfies, it looks better on the Realme C15. The one on the Poco is just a bit more yellowish and a bit fuzzier. And when it comes to daytime selfies, surprisingly, the Realme C15 is a bit warmer when it comes to the color compared to the Poco M3. In terms of clarity, I would say both phones are neck and neck in this area. And when we move on to portrait selfies, the Poco M3 has the more natural bokeh with the softer edges, which is great because it was the other way around when we were using the back camera.
When it comes to performance, the Poco M3 has a better chipset than the Realme C15. So the Poco M3 has a Snapdragon 662 chipset and the Realme C15 has a Snapdragon 460 chip. And it really shows when you start gaming.
So right, when it comes to gaming, it's obvious that the Poco M3 does better than the Realme C15. When you play games like Call of Duty Mobile, at the same settings, the Poco M3 fares better. Meanwhile, the Realme C3 seems to struggle just a bit. The settings we used were of course very high graphics with high frame rates. But when we move on to a graphically intensive game like Genshin Impact, then both phones will struggle even at the lowest graphics settings. But that's just mainly down to how demanding Genshin Impact is. When it comes to thermals, the Poco M3 does get warmer a lot faster than the Realme C15, but then again, it does have the more powerful chipset compared to its competitor here. But with that said, if you want a device for gaming, then the Poco M3 will be your choice.
Okay, so battery life. Both phones offer more or less the same. You'll get about an entire day of battery life with some light gaming, web browsing and navigation. So thankfully, there's 18 watt of fast charging for both phones, or else it'll take you forever just to charge these huge batteries.
Not forgetting to mention that the Poco M3 charges using a USB-C port. Meanwhile, the Realme uses a micro USB port. I mean, what year is it, Realme? But at the end of the day, if you want something with better performance, a nicer display and better audio for your media consumption, then perhaps the Poco M3 is your choice.
Yeah, but if you like taking photos more and you want a generally nicer looking phone, then I think the Realme C15 will be the one to get.
Well, let us know down in the comment section below which would you go for. Remember to give us a like,
subscribe to our channel KLGadgetTV, and I'll see you in the next one.
Bye.
We'll see you in the next one.